Hey everybody, on this episode of Unbeatable, I get a chance to connect with a Ranger buddy that I haven't talked to in a long time. This is not only an incredible warrior on the battlefield, but he's a guy who did a lot of hard work and made himself into a much better man after getting home from combat and many years of being overseas. And I think there's something that everybody can learn as you listen to this episode from Johnny Elsasser, my buddy from 2nd Ranger Battalion. Check it out.
These stories of triumph over adversity will help you handle your toughest days in life and become unbeatable.
Hey, Johnny, thank you for joining me on this episode of Unbeatable.
Yeah, absolutely, Jeff. I'm really honored to be on here with you and to jam out for a little bit and share with your community.
Yeah. Man, we're going to do some catching up on this episode because you and I haven't seen each other or talked to each other in more than a decade. But it's good to see you again, buddy, for those of you that are watching him on YouTube, or good to just hear your voice.
Yeah, likewise. I'll let everybody know it's really hard for me to not say Captain Strucker, so I'll be focused on Jeff for the show.
Yeah, please do. Just make it Jeff. I'll make it Johnny. We'll make it totally easy on the listeners that way.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we go back a little ways. We go back to 2nd Ranger Battalion at the same time back in early 2000s. But before we get into me and you serving in the same Ranger Battalion at the same time, let's go back a little bit farther with you. Let's go back to what life was like growing up. And because I know a little bit about your story, specifically what life was like at home when mom and dad were married, and then what happened after mom and dad split up.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was, I tell people this to my detriment and to my success. I was very present as a kid. And so when I was going through life, especially early on, I really was just focused on playing with friends and like playing sports and being involved in that stuff. And so everything was pretty great. Like it was just
typical American child. Yep.
Right. Exactly. It was like very blue collar family, like being before the street lights came on kind of thing, and just lived that kind of life and really enjoyed that. We didn't really like live in poverty, but we weren't like making a lot of money. It was basically paycheck to paycheck. So grew up in that hardworking middle class lifestyle. And then about like 14, 15 years old, ran into my parents getting divorced, which at the time, like I didn't really understand. Even though I was 14, 15 years old, I just didn't understand what that all meant for my life and for their life.
Yeah.
And so that's when I kind of like still just was able to be present, focused on my sports, focused on my friends and everything else. And I started to just kind of live my life and be as much out of the house as possible. All my friends could drive and everything was great. So I would try to be out of the house as much as possible and then just focused on who I was. But in that same vein, I ended up not really knowing what I was going to do. My parents were focused on their divorce. Yeah. I ended up getting to the end of high school, not knowing where I was going to go, like hadn't done anything for college. I was on a great soccer team. And I was a very good soccer player, but I'd done nothing to set myself up for a scholarship, like nothing.
All right. Yeah.
And that was what led me into an Army recruiting office at 17 years old. So that was like my story from, reaching that divorce, really finding myself and just my friends and being outside of the home, but then not having anybody to really usher me into what life looked like after high school,
Man, there's a lot of similarities between my story and yours. And I want to get to what happens next after you're in the recruiter's office.
Yeah.
But if we can go back for just a second, man, lots of people, millions and millions of American kids go through experience a parent's divorce. Mm-hmm. For a lot of them, it sticks with them for a lifetime. For some of them, it kind of rolls with the punches. But for the kids that have never, for the people that listening that have kind of never gone through that, why did this impact you so much? Because some kids just roll with it. Others, it's a catastrophic event in their life.
Yeah, absolutely. And it does. It's got that like dichotomy of like it can be one or the other for a lot of people. And for me, it affected me a lot because the fact that it pushed me into my own autonomy. My parents they weren't mature enough in their own individuality to understand that the kids, like especially myself, my brother was a couple years older than me. So he was already like borderline at college. He had already a lot of development. I was like early years of high school. and my sister was very young. And so I don't think they had that level of maturity in themselves to understand that we still needed a lot of like ushering in life. And so it impacted me a lot because I had to find my own autonomy, because I didn't really want to be around that environment. Just because they didn't really know what was going on with themselves. And I was like, okay, well, let me find who I am and just stay away from that. And honestly, what was really interesting, Jeff, is that, like, and some people would think this is really weird. I was fortunate enough that I had somebody who was a big influence in my life, which was my uncle. And my uncle still to this day, he and I are very close. And one of the interesting thing though, is that my aunt and my uncle had 3 boys, and I was very close with all of them. And they said, hey, come stay at the house. So I would come to the house, but they didn't have like a spare bedroom for me. They were packed. So we actually put a tent.
All right.
We put a tent in the backyard. And
oh, yes, I love it.
I love that you love that, because most people would be like, oh my God, you were a kid in a tent. And I was like, no,
man. Hey, why don't you come hang out with us? But you're going to have to sleep in the yard in a tent. Right. Which for a 14-year-old boy, that's pretty cool right there.
I know. And it was great. So I was fortunate enough that like my aunt and uncle, I was in a great environment with them because I love them. I love my cousins. We were all close in age, so I was able to get a lot of connection there. And then I also had kind of some autonomy being in the tent in the backyard and being able to like have my uncle who was
because it's your tent. I can do what I want in my tent in your backyard.
Yep, exactly. And my uncle, who was like my mentor, was still there to guide me along the way. So that, I think, really helped soften the blow. And to any kids out there, anybody experiencing that, like, that's one of the things I can say is like, look to those mentors. They don't necessarily have to be your parents that can influence you in the right direction.
Definitely. How long were you in the tent? How long did you stay out there in the backyard?
It was between about, I can't remember the exact time frame, but it was between about 6 months to about a year. I was actually back there in high school, like hanging out, and it was fun. It was fun.
I'm impressed, man. No wonder why you did well in the Army and in the Ranger Regiment. If you can suck up a summer and a winter in a tent in the backyard, man, it shows a little bit about how tough you are.
Yeah.
So what prompts you to go? Obviously, life is just tossed upside down when mom and dad divorced.
Right.
And you don't have to go to a recruiter's office. What pushed you into a U.S. Army recruiter's office?
Well, I'll take us back for 1 second. It was really very interesting. So this was early 2000s, and it was before like internet was like mainstream stuff. So people weren't surfing the internet. We didn't have like this. We didn't have the smartphones. Like, it wasn't that. And I had one of my best friends came up to me, and he says, he just starts talking about special operations. And I knew nothing about this. I didn't have a military pedigree whatsoever.
Really?
Yeah.
A friend from school.
Yeah. A friend from school just started talking. He goes, have you heard of these guys, like special forces and like Army Rangers and Navy SEALs? And I was like, I haven't heard. I mean, I knew of like Navy SEALs and special forces from movies, but I was like, I don't know what they do. I don't even like know how you go to be them. And I started looking at them, and I actually really didn't care for like the background or the training of like what the SEALs and the Special Forces did, but I loved the Army Rangers. I was like, oh, if I was gonna go, that would be something cool to do. And I ended up in an Army recruiting office, and that was because my mother at the time, she was dating a gentleman who had been in the Air Force. And he talked about the military, and he's like, hey, you don't know what you're doing. You haven't signed up for college. Why don't you just go talk to them and see what they have to offer? And I was like, okay, whatever. So I go in there and talk to them, and I figured I could talk to them about being a Ranger. And as you know, it's not really that way, because they just want you to go where they need you.
Right. Yep. That's right. You go where the Army needs you.
Exactly. Yeah. And at the time, we were really hot in Fallujah, because this is roughly around 2004. So we were hot in Fallujah. Both the Marines and the Army were hot in Fallujah. And so they wanted to push me to a unit called 3rd ID, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. They wanted to get me into
very
3rd.
Familiar with it. Great dudes.
Right, exactly. They wanted to put me in the broken TV, and they said, hey, man, we're going to sign you up for the infantry and go to 3rd ID. And they were like, hey, I was like, well, what about Rangers? Like, how do I go to one of the battalions? How to become an Army Ranger? They go, oh, just go to your unit, and then you can talk to them about that, and then they'll get you there. And I was like, and as you know, that's not how that works either.
That's right.
So that was how I ended up in the Army recruiting office. I didn't know where I was going. I had somebody who had spoken to me about it. I gave it a shot, and being present, I was just kind of like, I'll take what comes for me. And I grew up in that blue collar family, that blue collar mindset. So I had grit. and I was a very good athlete. So I had the potential to do anything in the military physically. Right. And so I was like, I'll give it a shot and see where this all takes me. You know, that was kind of like the exploration phase.
That's interesting because when I'm standing in a recruiter's office, I'm still a senior in high school. I got no idea, like you, what I'm going to do with the rest of my life. And I had a buddy whose dad said, Jeff, if you're really thinking about this, like, I think you ought to reconsider. But if you're really seriously thinking about this, go work with the toughest, the best people in the military. And he didn't point out the Rangers, but he basically said, go try out for the elite forces and go see how that goes. And that's what brought me to a recruiter's office. Like you, the recruiter's like, we can't make you a Ranger, but we can totally send you, to Germany or to some infantry unit. But this recruiter did a little bit of research and he said, hey, look, man, there is a way if we can get you into the U.S. Army's airborne course, there's a way that you can volunteer. At that point, it's all on you, but we'll hook you up and we'll get you there. And I was like, okay, man, I'll take whatever I can get because I couldn't get that guaranteed contract to try out.
Yeah. And
so it sounds like you were pretty strong, pretty tough mentally, but also in great shape if you played soccer, in school.
Yeah. And
so tell me about, going through all of the training before you end up as a private in 2nd Ranger Battalion.
Well, this to me is the most fascinating part of my story because it was like divine intervention for me. So I had talked about going to be a Ranger. I tried to get it. They suckered me into getting into the military, and in my in my contract it says I'm going to 3rd ID after basic training, and I was just going through and just being able to be a PT stud, I stood out. And one of my drill sergeants who to this day, and I cannot overstate the importance of mentors in our lives and to be, just be aware that they can come in all shapes and sizes. Just be aware that they're there. And I'm in basic training, getting my butt kicked. And one of the guys that's there is Drill Sergeant Paul. And he was fair.
Yeah, everyone remembers their drill sergeant's name, by the way. So it doesn't surprise me that you not only told me who it was, but you gave me his name.
Yep, exactly. And Drill Sergeant Paul, he was fair, but he was harsh because he wanted to see who could be elite because he actually would go out of his way to try to help you get there. Well, I didn't know this at the time, but he had seen me and he had been paying attention, and he was like, I get out of chow one day and he goes, hey, Elsasser. He's got this North Carolina accent and it's just hilarious. Always called me Elsasser. Hey, Elsasser, come here. And I was like, oh crap, dude, what did I do? You know this. You never want to get yelled at by a drill sergeant because it's just always trouble. Yeah. So I get over there and I'm like, yeah, drill sergeant. And he goes, hey, what do you want? You want ranges? You want snipers? You want special forces? Where you want to go? And I was like, Army Rangers, drill sergeant. And he goes, all right, get upstairs. So I get upstairs. About the next day, same thing happens. I get out of chow and he calls me over again, pulls out a piece of paper. It's a brand new contract going to airborne school and then RIP.
What?
I'm not kidding you. I'm not kidding you.
That's incredible.
Pulls this out and has me sign the new contract on his back and then takes it in and puts me in. And the next thing you know, boom, I'm in. I go to airborne school and then I hit RIP, made it through RIP. And I was in it was another divine thing for me. So being a California boy, there's only 3 battalions. You know this. 1st and 3rd are in Georgia. And then I'm going, and I wanted to go to 2nd Ranger Battalion over in Washington, naturally, closer to home.
Out in the West Coast.
Yeah. So I get into the, how they pick, they're like, all right, get in the line behind the battalion, and then they'll move. They'll cut it off wherever because they know how many each battalion can take. And they literally cut off 2nd Ranger Battalion at me. So the guy behind me gets moved over.
Wow.
Yeah. The guy behind me gets moved over to, I believe it was 3rd Bat, to go, stay in Benning. And I literally just right behind me. And I was like, oh, wow. So that's how I ended up in 2nd Ranger Battalion, then ended up in your sphere of influence.
Yeah. So I showed up to 2nd Ranger Battalion a little bit before you, but I think we spent a good part of your career in the Army together. Hey, by the way, for the listener who just heard him say RIP, that doesn't stand for rest in peace, although there's a whole lot of people that just crash and burn in. And while they're in the Ranger Indoctrination Program, now called the Ranger Assessment and Selection Program, it's the thing that guys go through to try out for the Ranger Regiment, and the attrition rate is high.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't even need to tell the listener that Johnny is a rock solid warrior just to get there. But then the guys that get there, the workload and the operational tempo and how dangerous the job is, it just burns through people. Mm-hmm. A lot of people get broken. A lot of people can't handle it. Johnny, you stay there for several years, do 4 combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. And you have this unusual experience. So you know what it was like to go to combat as a private. Mm-hmm. Then you get promoted a couple of times and you become a leader, and you go back to combat as a squad leader. Yeah. And I just thought it would be a good it would be good for the listeners to understand just how different that first combat deployment was as a private versus maybe your last one as a Ranger squad leader.
Yeah.
Can you kind of describe the differences of those two?
Oh, I love this question because I've never actually thought about it in the sense of putting it out on a podcast, but this will be great. Oh man,
I was there too. So I mean, I kind of have an idea of what the difference was like.
Yeah. I mean, it's pretty wild the difference between when you're there as a private and then obviously there as a leader. And, as a private, I can literally remember my first mission and sitting on, after we squared away all the vehicles and prepped everything, and we literally hit the ground. I think we hit the ground about dusk, and we were already hitting our first mission that night. It was probably a few hours later. We had
Where was your, hold on for just a second. Yeah. What theater was your first combat operation in?
So we were up in northern Iraq, Mosul.
Okay, so you were in Iraq, up in Mosul, Iraq at the time, or in that general area.
Yep. Yeah.
Yep. All right.
So
keep going.
We sit there, and literally that night, we are hitting the ground running, and I'm sitting there on ammo cans. It's my first mission as a private, and all that's going through my head is literally don't mess up your fundamentals. Just walk through everything and just keep doing that. And so I sat there, and this was before I knew anything about visualization. This was just me this was my way of almost kind of calming that anxiety, calming that anticipation of chaos, right? And it was going to be for real. But I mean, obviously, this, we trained very highly in training before we get to theater. So it was pretty easy once you step into that. But that's all I was thinking. And then on top of that, it's kind of miserable being a private. You get back and you have all these other...
It's the toughest job in the military, hands down. Being a private in a Ranger Battalion, it doesn't get any more difficult than that.
No, you have all these other duties, plus you're still getting smoked when you mess up. Plus, you still gotta get all the little things done that take care of not just you, but take care of any of the specialists, takes care of the sergeants, takes care of the squad and the platoon, all of the things that you're doing as a private that you did back in the rear, you still do overseas. They just look a little different, and you still have the inflection of being smoked when you mess stuff up. And so it's there's no, I think that's one of the things with Spec Ops is there's no foot off the gas. There's never we're here. There's none, because there's such a high standard and a low margin for error, when you're at that level. And so as a private, there's a lot of days where you're sitting there wow, do I really want this that bad? I am getting the crap kicked out of me.
What did I get myself into, right? Everybody asked that question.
Yep.
What did I just get myself into?
There was days I used to think about RIP, wow, that was easy compared to this. That was really easy compared to this. And it didn't let up. So there was a lot there. There was a lot involved, from having to prep not only equipment, but prep yourself. You still had to work out every day. You still had to man some of the posts that were on maybe 1 or 2 deployments. There was the ability where we still, in our little area, we had to man certain fire posts basically.
Yeah, had to provide your own protection, right?
Correct, pretty much. And that was also part of the added complexity of being a private.
Stress of the job.
Right?
Yeah.
Little sleep.
Yeah.
So that added to it. And then the difference with being a squad leader was your job. Like you were sitting there being like, how do I make sure that I bring everybody home? How do I make sure that I set these guys up for success so that when chaos happens, they all know exactly what to do. They know how to do the job of the guy ahead of them, and they can make sure that they're trained to the highest level so they're not losing their life and nobody around them is. And like you're really obsessed with that as in my opinion, as a squad leader, or as a team leader as well. You're obsessed with like, okay, I'm training these guys hard because I don't want them to have some fatal accident. Yeah. Right. And
I mean, ultimately, the job of a leader in combat is to bring defeat the enemy, accomplish the mission, but bring your guys home.
Exactly.
And the ability to bring them home is largely determined by how hard you train before you go over there. Mm-hmm. Because once you're there, and whatever happens next. So, man, I, like you, did many deployments. Yeah. My first deployment, I was a squad or a team leader. And I really only had myself to look out for because I was on a team of nothing but NCOs. But as a private, you're not only making sure that you don't do anything wrong and compromise the mission, but you're also making sure that you don't hold your unit back.
Right.
Well, I asked the question because, Johnny, it's almost the exact same coin, just the opposite side of it. As a squad leader, team leader, as a leader in combat, now you're thinking the exact same thing, but you're thinking about it times 5, times 10, times 50 or 500 or 50,000, depending on the level that you're leading at. And man, the intensity never slows down. It remains being in special operations and combat. It never lets up.
No.
Especially in a unit as disciplined and that goes out on as many objectives as a unit like the Ranger Regiment.
Mm-hmm.
So, man, I just got to tell you, it was an honor to serve with guys like you. Thank you for serving the country. But your service to our country doesn't end when you leave the Ranger Regiment and leave the Army. You transition and keep serving, and now serving as a contractor, working around U.S. embassies and even worse, around U.S. ambassadors in the height of the big fight in Iraq. So tell us about serving as a contractor over in Iraq and the 3 ambassadors that you worked with.
Yeah. And I would like to say thank you, Jeff. Like you provided a lot of stability, especially when we were there as like at the time you were chaplain, and it was amazing to have you there to kind of hold, because you had seen and been through a lot of intense stuff in your career by that point. And it was really great to have you as somebody in our corner, and also as a stability feature for us. So thank you for that as well in your service, Jeff. Really thanks, grateful for that.
Yeah.
When it came to protecting ambassadors, this was a very, very different job. And the whole thing was, we went from, Ranger Battalion where we're playing offense, right, to now doing protection where you're playing defense. Like you don't want anything.
And to the extreme, right?
Yeah.
Right? Like you have to protect him from every single spot on, where he goes.
Yeah, exactly. And like and the thing is we had one ambassador where he was former special forces. So there wasn't any place he didn't want to go.
Oh, I can only imagine what that was like.
He was one of the only ambassadors. He carried a pistol in his briefcase, and he actually qualled on his pistol. So he was able to carry that with him per State Department standards. And he was amazing. I loved him, but he also wanted to go any and everywhere. He was like, he didn't care.
Which made your life miserable, right?
100%. When we would go to places like Solder City at the time, Solder, you knew this, Solder ran like kind of his own place, and it was his jurisdiction. Right. And we would go to Solder City, and one of the times we went there, he wanted to go speak with him. And literally, I think it was just about maybe 30 days before that, maybe less, a British principal had been killed in Solder City, blown up, shot, killed. and his team.
Yeah.
And we're like, oh, that's our intel. And it's literally just under Solder's control. And you're just like, all right.
Yeah.
Well, we got to make this work. So we got to figure it out.
That's right.
So it was very different to be on a defensive minded mission tempo and then also to plan your missions according to that too. And when you're experiencing that, you don't have a choice of saying no because the ambassador's like, I'm going, right? So
that's right.
Your job is, how do I make it happen? And how do I make it happen so well that I protect not only this principal, but I also protect my entire team, right? And so that becomes a whole dynamic in and of itself because it's a lot of the principles of being in Ranger Battalion, but then there's a whole added element to this where you're looking for, you're just sitting ducks, really, in a lot of cases. You're like, how can I best do this to where I'm like a sitting duck they don't really want to approach? Like, so that was kind of the dynamic there. But doing it for 3 different ambassadors was very interesting because you have different mindsets, different ways of handling the politics.
Different personalities.
Yeah. And I was there when they negotiated the nuclear treaty with the Iranians. I was there when Maliki would not give up power to I can't remember what his other name was. I think Alawi was the other one. And Maliki would not give his power up, and he lost the votes, but yet they ended up having to create like 2 prime ministerships. It was very interesting times. Right. So I was there for all of that and had to kind of negotiate, obviously, like what that was like as far as being security in that present, because there was a different level. It was very interesting. I noticed a different level of relationship with Maliki because Maliki had his own private army where they used to be very inviting to us. But then when he lost the election to Alawi and the U.S. ambassador would go to talk to Maliki about all these things, their security posture changed towards us. And we had to be very aware of this. So
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I ask you that question because part of the job of securing an ambassador, taking care of, doing the defense that you just called it, nobody ever pats you on the back or recognizes when you do your job right. But if you do your job wrong and something happens, it's on the front page of every newspaper on the planet.
International incident.
The pressure that goes along with that job, you can just never, ever slip up.
Nope.
And that kind of pressure is really hard to live under. So the fact that you did that for 5 years, I got mad respect, man.
Thank you, Jeff. Appreciate that.
But there's a point where you kind of transition away from the military, no longer contracting. And I think it's fascinating. You called it an extremely arduous transition.
Mm-hmm.
Almost every special operations guy that I know says similar language. Like, I thought it was going to be easy to transition, but it's not.
Yeah.
So what made this transition extremely arduous? Why was it so hard for you to transition away from that lifestyle?
It was, it was very difficult because what had built me into the man that I was at that time, a lot of that didn't serve me to transition into the quote unquote real world. And part of that was the fact that, like, you know, I was living in hostile environments where you're looking at threats all the time. You're classifying people by their body language and perspective, and also the environment you're in. And when you come home and you still have that mindset, it really causes a fracture in how you can even relate to people that are around. And so that was part of it. And then the other part was the arduous was the fact that, like, you had to come to terms that you had to start questioning your own mindset. You had to start questioning the way you saw the world. And in that questioning, you had to take ownership of some of the limitations, of some of the beliefs that you had, and had to tell yourself, like, well, is this serving me now? Is this actually helping me be a better man in the world today? And the hard part is, especially when you come from that elite background, is you already know how strong you are, how strong your foundation is. And you've already become this this very principled man. But then you're like, holy crap, if I keep the same mindset of that man, there's a chance I'm going to have 0 friends. I'm going to constantly look at everybody as a threat. I'm going to fracture relationships because I'll have not a lot of emotional intelligence because I haven't looked at my own emotions. And you're like, wow, I'm going to start having a lot of toxic relationships here. And that's what I ended up experiencing. That was part of that, is because you're not fighting anymore this external force. You're actually fighting this internal force. And you're having to have that battle internally, and you know the truth. You can't lie to yourself. So that becomes the conflict.
I want to pump the brakes here for just a second, because you're talking about something that is extremely important. I think that there are listeners right now that are going through a arduous transition like you and I went through. But I also think there's a lot of people that are like, I don't get it. Why would this be so difficult? So Johnny, you're describing really well now the things that made you successful in combat were your ability to shut parts of you down and to focus and to function and not to basically be a normal human being while you're over there. Those things kept you alive while you're on the battlefield. But when you leave the battlefield, those things that kept you alive, that were very good things, and don't get me wrong, it doesn't mean that you or I or the brothers and sisters in arms did anything wrong overseas, but those things that served you well and kept you alive on the battlefield are now harming you and holding you back in times of peace. And there are countless men and women that I know who said, the only thing I'm good at is killing. And now that I'm not in war anymore, I don't know what to do with the rest of my life. Some of them, it's so traumatic that they decide, I don't want to live anymore. I'm going to do the one thing that I'm good at. I'm going to put a pistol in my mouth and I'm going to end it all, because I guess the only thing that I'm made for is war. And now I have to live in peacetime. So again, I pumped the brakes for just a second so you can go back and describe just in a little bit more detail for listeners right now how challenging the things that made you successful on the battlefield are now hurting your abilities to integrate into society and have healthy relationships. Can you go into a little bit more detail?
Yeah, absolutely.
For people that have never gone through this arduous transition.
Well, one of the pieces that you carry is judgment, right? And you judge a lot of other people and environments in that. And that's what I carried. I struggled with that. And if you hold that judgment, especially coming out of that environment, you can't create relationships that are fruitful. You can't create relationships that are connective. And because the fact you're constantly looking at ways to judge people, and from there, you're just criticizing every move they have. But also, I was holding, and a lot of people do this from the elite aspect, but from the military too, is even in the general military, there's a higher level of standard for people, right, than the everyday person, the average person. And so all of a sudden you're put into this pool of people where their standards are way below yours. And you're like, how do I assimilate to this? Like, how do I connect with this? This is like, to some aspects, it's like, it's almost insulting. You're like, these people have no concept of this standard. And when you start measuring other people to this standard, you start realizing there's very few people that are going to meet that. And then you start hermit crabbing in, and you start isolating yourself. And what happens is a majority of those relationships you had from the military or from protection from the paramilitary groups, what happens is distance creates distance. And we're not great at constantly staying in connection.
That needs to be said again for somebody who's driving and missed that one, because it's absolutely true. Say that one more time.
Distance creates distance. And that is something that we as humans and we as people who've come out of the military or these environments, we're not great at keeping those flames of relationship alive with people that we served with, even for decades. And all of a sudden, we're now isolated. We have almost no friends. We have potentially maybe a spouse or a partner, but they can't handle a lot of potentially what we've gone through. And to share with them could bring them down. And most of us don't want to do that. So we isolate, and then we self-medicate, and then we start to we criticize, and then we start to beat up on every move that we make. And then we start to be like, oh, I used to be capable of this, and now I'm just sitting behind a desk pressing buttons. So all of this compiles and just creates this large heaping trash of self-loathing. And this is where the transition becomes difficult, because you have a standard you're not meeting. You have judgment that you're holding against everybody else. You have criticism of yourself because you're not meeting the standard. Then you also have isolated yourself from friends and family, people who can't understand why you're the way you are once you get back home. And all of that mindset just holds you back from a lot of this connection. And so that creates the difficulty. I hope that kind of explains it a lot better for people out there.
What you just described is that's where the distance comes in. And the distance is not necessarily geographic. It's just the space between two people that might be in the same house, even sleeping in the same bed, but they're in totally different worlds because one of them is really struggling to, process and to get connected and relate to people well again. You're actually describing tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of warriors that are going through the same thing that you've went through, I went through, many others have gone through.
Yeah.
But I wanted to camp on this one for a second, Johnny, because I know this part of your story. One of my good friends, I had a chance to do an episode with him. He is a legendary Ranger. And his name is JB Spizo. And JB said, man, I could handle anything the Army threw at me, anything the enemy threw at me. And then there was a moment that I went through a divorce. And I found myself, this is JB's own words, laying on the floor in the fetal position, crying uncontrollably, and I can't get off the floor. And I'm thinking to myself, what kind of man am I that I can't handle the pain of divorce? And JB just laid out for everybody how challenging this was. I know a little bit about your story, Johnny, so I want you to talk about how that distance impacted your relationship and how it really ended up in divorce. But more importantly, would you tell everybody what happened to you as a result of that divorce?
Yeah, I mean, this is a powerful part, and JB is a legendary human. I love JB, but he's right. Like, I struggled with my own inability to transfer the pertinent skills that I had to the regular life and leave some of the skills that were holding me back behind. And so I started to drink way too much. I was living for the weekend. I wasn't paying attention to my wife at the time. Our relationship was getting that distance. We were isolating each other. And this was a crazy thing. She'd be up on the middle floor and I'd be down on the bottom floor, and I'd be like watching football or something. She'd be up watching a TV show. And as you said, we're in the same house, but we're distant. We're distant emotionally. We're distancing ourselves physically. We couldn't have the conversations and communication that could have helped us to keep that relationship alive. And so as I continued to live for the weekend and just drink on my back deck and cook on the barbecue and not pay as much attention to her, we started to have a worse and worse relationship that ended up culminating in a divorce. And I don't know if many people know this, but when you're in the top 1% of being elite, you pride yourself on being a man that can endure and can make things like you can handle
pain and hardship.
You can handle pain, hardship. Your sacrifice is nothing to you. Like, you are a man of all men, right? Like, that's the embodiment that you have of yourself. But then you end up in a divorce, and that is like, there's almost nothing you can imagine as more of a failure. You couldn't keep a family together. You couldn't keep a relationship together. And that hit me really hard. Just like JB, I was struggling with the fact, like, who was I? I was elite at this one point, going overseas and hunting terrorists. I was protecting U.S. ambassadors. And now I was a failed man that was just drinking way too much, who didn't like who he saw in the mirror, and ended up in a divorce that he couldn't keep a relationship together. And he promised that he would, right? He broke a promise. And all of that hit me to be, wow, okay, man, like, either you need to start changing and get back to something that resembles the man you used to be, or you can go down this elite path of being an elite piece of crap. Like, you can do one or the other.
Yeah.
So you can either be an elite piece of crap, or you can be an elite human again, elite man again. But you got to make that decision now. Because I was tired of it. I was so sick and tired of looking in the mirror and not recognizing the guy I saw.
Yeah.
So that was where that turned.
Describe how bad that divorce shook up your identity and really this is setting us up now for people to learn what you learned about yourself, about masculinity through this divorce, through the transition out of the military and this divorce. I mean, describe just a little bit about how it shook your identity and forced you to start to look for who you are and forge a new identity, basically.
Yeah, it really challenged me as a man, because I again, my uncle was also my mentor, and he was a strong man in and of himself. And you know, there was a very big tie to God and to religion growing up, and to have that failed marriage also shook that part of me too. And so I was sitting there and just broken down and living in this little ratty apartment in Virginia at the time, and just thinking to myself, like, your choice right now is to do something, anything, one thing that can give you some form of connection back to yourself. And for me, it was the gym, right? So going back to the elite status of being physical, I was like, do a bodybuilding show. That was my goal. And I put my my mind to a bodybuilding show, and I delivered on that, because I knew that if I put a flag in the sand, I'm going to get to that flag. And so I did. And for me, that was the first climb out of this, because at the end of the day, if I didn't have a goal, I was going to continue the spiral. I knew that. I was so broken at that point. I didn't know who I was as a man. I didn't have my standards that I used to have. I had like my foundational morals, but the standards I used to have were drifting, right? And so when I was like, well, give yourself the standards that you used to have, which was elite. All right, do a bodybuilding show. So I showed up and did that. And I gave myself 12 weeks to prep. I had a coach, and I started to say, okay, this is my climb out.
Nice.
Cut off alcohol, focused, because you can't do that during bodybuilding, focused on strictly doing bodybuilding and eating the right way, and showed up on stage 12 weeks later and took third, but did really, really well for what I thought. And I thought I looked great. So
third place in 12 weeks is very impressive.
And I loved it, and I looked great, and I felt great. And I was like, that was a win for me. For me, that was the 1 foot forward where I touched that elite soldier again. I touched that elite man again. And I was like, okay, there's standards here. There's standards that you remember. And so from there, I still had a lot of the judgment that I carried around, and I still had a lot of that negativity towards other people and their standards. But at the time, I had a good friend who's now my gorgeous wife. She threw me a book, and that was Excuses Be Gone by the late and great Dr. Wayne Dyer.
All right. Yeah.
I look at the book, and naturally I say, I'm not going to read this crap, because who is he to tell me how to be a man?
That's right. Yeah.
I was like, I'm former Spec Ops. I'm former all this. Like, who is this guy? So I still had that judgment. And it took a couple months later. I was like, Johnny, if nothing changes, nothing changes. Okay. You got to do something.
There's a good quote right there too.
Yeah. If nothing changes, nothing changes. You got to do something different. And so I went back and grabbed the book, and I said, all right, I'm going to read this. I'm going to give it a shot, because I don't want to continue to be this man with the failed marriage. I don't want the same future that I have right now. And so I read the book, and it was like a punch in my gut, because the way he writes is very direct, but very eloquent. And you're like, oh man, I cannot run from myself anymore. All of these things are insecurities. And then you had to come to realize, like, oh crap, all these things that I thought were strengths were insecurities. And that shook my foundation of like, oh, I got to reframe some things. I got to really question this.
Well, obviously, some of the listeners have already connected the dots. I asked you about your parents' divorce because of how much it shook you. And then when you go through a divorce, it's ground shaking.
Yeah.
But actually, in your case, there's a lot of good that comes out of it on the other side. You and I both know a lot of people that go through what you went through, and they turn to the pills, to the bottle, or worse, to a pistol. But man, you learned some things. You learned some very powerful things as a result of that divorce, that book, and just rethinking who you are as a man. I mean, you actually redefined your opinions of masculinity. Yeah. And now is where we get into the meat of who you are and what you're doing now. So would you tell some people what you learned about the art of masculinity going through this whole process? But also, would you describe some of the really bad ways that society pushes guys, or the bad descriptions of masculinity that a lot of guys are getting out there?
Yeah, this is a great question. And the first thing I have to say is, like, before I even start, when I read that book, the next challenge to that was the fact that it shook and it caused me to have to reframe. But I took it as a challenge to myself. I wanted to create strengths out of weaknesses.
Good for you.
And that was, like, for me, being somebody who held himself to a very high standard, who persevered through all these things. I said, all right, well, I'm going to challenge myself to turn these weaknesses into a strength. And that was my whole goal. That set me on a different trajectory. Having that perspective was what really pushed me to be like, I'm going to learn everything I can and then do the reframing and do the introspection to help me grow as a man. And so I dove into this and I started to consume everything I could, first on self-development. And then I was having a conversation with my friend at the time, again, my wife now. I was having a conversation with her and I was like, oh my God, like, so many of the men I talked to overseas, I started thinking about the conversations and they were like, they'd be happy, Jeff, to be in the Middle East after coming home, coming back from home, being with their wives and their kids. And I'm like, guys, what is going on? And I started to think about this at this time. And I was like, oh my God, if I was struggling with all this and they were struggling with all this and none of us were talking about it, how do we get this perspective to start being opened up so we can create healthy, strong men? Because these guys are the strength in masculinity that we need to stand up to like the people that are trying to push men around or push society around. We need those good men to stand up, but they also need to find themselves first. And so I was like, well, how do we do this? And this is where I came up with the podcast, because my background, I was like, well, enough guys will give me some respect to say, hey, let me listen to him for 5 minutes. So I was like, if they're going to give me 5 minutes, I need to deliver. And so I was like, I got to consume everything. And by this point, I had accumulated 3 degrees, pretty much a 4th degree from the State Department by becoming a contracting officer.
Wow.
So I was great at researching, needless to say. And I was like, let me research and consume.
Definitely.
So I did that, and I started to read books sociologically on masculinity and how some of the studies have gone about and what they've come up with, and things that really how we form who we are as men. Because if we can't understand how we form it, we can't understand how to go back and reframe it to be authentic with who we are as a man and how we stand in our own presence today. And so I started to consume that information, go through it. I started to read a lot on how we can rewire the brain neurologically through Dr. Joe Dispenza, and epigenetics through Dr. Bruce Lipton. And I was very avid in consuming that information so I could pass it along to men and say, listen, it's not an old dog can't learn new tricks. It's an old dog unwilling to learn new tricks won't learn new tricks.
Yeah, that's right.
But every man can learn how to reframe if he's willing to give himself the time and the practice. So I started to see this, and then I started to see that there was this attack on masculinity, and that was from, these terms like toxic masculinity, which is, it's an embarrassment to the English language in my opinion, because if you go to etymology, toxicity means unfit for consumption. You're saying masculinity is not fit for society, and that's completely wrong.
Right.
And so these things that people were using to bully men and to confuse men and to really shake their foundations challenged me again, because I was like, oh, heck no. Like, I'm going to stand up and fight against this. And I'm going to stand up and fight against this by giving men.
Like a fighter would.
Exactly.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm going to stand up and fight against this. And how am I going to do that? I'm not going to do it alone. I'm going to help build men. I'm going to help build men to really trust in their foundation, trust in their authenticity. So when this comes up to their doorstep, they're able to stand and own who they are as a positive, good, healthy man in this world, and be able to influence this negative connotation of masculinity and push it back. And so through that's where I started to create the art of masculinity, because there's a development of masculinity that isn't art. There are a number of traits that I believe reside in masculinity and in men. And any man, an accumulation of those traits can make him a good, strong man in this world.
Yeah.
And not every accumulation of those traits looks the same in every man. And so it's really just finding that authenticity in some of those and then putting those into your foundation, holding those, and then presenting those through your actions and through your words. And that's what I've started to help men really find in their lives and really start to cultivate and create.
That's where the word art comes from, right? Because it's not the same for every guy in every circumstance. No. It's different. We're all different, but masculinity, when it's done right, is powerful. It's healthy. It's actually a very beautiful thing for society.
It's the balance.
When masculinity is done wrong, man, it is catastrophic. It just hurts everybody around it when masculinity is confused. So when did you launch the Art of Masculinity podcast? How old is it?
That was back in about I want to say I got serious about the August of 2018, where I think I launched it in 2018, but then August.
Oh, you're an OG podcaster, man.
I was like 2000, the August, I was like, no. I'm, again, the challenge. I'm dedicated to this now. And it was like, I showed up, no matter what. And so that was when I really started to get behind it in my own personality and development and be like, okay, this is part of who I am now. And so about then, August, I started it and started to really just grow and expand on it, and it pushed me to continue my research. It pushed me to continue accumulating knowledge, because I never want to under deliver. You know this, like there's that standard again. Like,
yeah, man, absolutely.
I never want to under deliver for people, and I want to make sure that I'm giving the best information that I can. And I'm not going to try to influence them to think like me, but I want to give them things to think about and to consider on their own and challenge their own perspective with. And so in all of that, I ended up reframing, and you asked me this question a little earlier, I want to make sure I address it, is that I ended up reframing even the man that I was, and I created a core value of traits in who I am that were centered around 4 pieces, which was intelligence, communication, protector, and empathy. And I solidified in those in my foundation, because if I can present myself that way in every conversation, if I can present myself that way in every interaction, I am 100% consistent with who I am, and I'm not going to leave that conversation or that environment with shame, guilt, and regret. And that's most of the pain that men carry, and I wanted to relieve myself from that. And part of that means you got to cut some things out of your life, and potentially that means if guys act a fool when they're on alcohol because they can't understand, like, you can have 1 drink and you don't have to have 20.
Right.
That means that if you're not going to own that man when you're drinking, you probably shouldn't be drinking. And that was just my perspective. So
that is well said right there, man. Yep. Totally agree.
And that was it. That was
I love the fact that you've dug deep enough that you were able to identify, kind of your big 4 areas of who I am as a man. And I'm going to show up with all 4 of these areas wherever I go, whatever I do. Obviously, like a true special operator, you deliver more than you promise. But you take it steps farther than just the Art of Masculinity podcast. So you develop the Wild Man experience and then the Elite Man community. Yeah. Why don't you tell the listeners about these in case they want to get connected?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Jeff. The Wild Man experience for me was that I loved what we did. I loved being a Ranger. I loved being in helicopters. I love shooting guns. I love running around. I love doing those things. And so I said, well, how could I, and you probably hear this too, is a lot of men are like, oh, I wish I could have served. I wanted to, but I just, life circumstances changed.
Definitely.
And they have a lot of gratitude for the military. And I said, well, how can I give men an experience, the fun stuff that we did, not all the hard stuff, but the fun stuff.
Yeah, without getting shot at, but being able to do some cool stuff. Yes.
Right. So how can I give them the cool stuff without all the hard things that we did? And then also interlace that with the development that I've done when I transitioned out. And so that's what I came up with, was the Wild Man experience. And it's an homage to Robert Bly and the Iron John book, where he talks about the wild man in all of us. And that wild man is that unadulterated, uninfluenced man that was truly sovereign in himself before society took it all away from him. And so that wild man was what I came up with for it, because I loved that book and I loved that message in him. But I wanted to give men this fun environment, this really good, like, hangout environment where we could also grow as men. And it wasn't about like football and like nachos. It was about, hey man, what are you struggling with right now? How's life going?
Right.
How do you feel proud of yourself right now? How are you delivering your version of a man to your family? And it's having that real conversation while having a lot of fun. So there's the one where we shoot guns out of helicopters and moving cars. And we run around a range and do these mini stress shoots where they have to run and shoot and all that stuff. And then I take guys also up to Kodiak, Alaska, and we go deep sea fishing and we climb mountains and we do meditation at the top of a mountain. And then we'll also go out in the rivers and do some fly fishing, and we'll go take a boat plane and see Kodiak bears. And so there's a lot of fun in there, but then again, we're having real conversations as men on top of all of that. So I created that for men to get there. And then the elite man community, the reason I created this was because, again, an homage to being a Ranger and elite, was that if we always put time, when we were Rangers, we put time into our training so much that no matter what happened around us, we were so good at the fundamentals. That's why our fundamentals, our lowest level of training was so high, it surpassed everybody else. And yet as individual men, we forget that we also have to put that training into who we are personally every single day. And so everything that we do, when we're reading books, when we're journaling, when we're meditating, these are elements of giving back to the man that we are so we can be elite in how we show up. It doesn't necessarily just mean being a professional football player or an elite military operator. It also means being somebody who prides himself on building strong foundations in who he is every day, interpersonally. And so that's why I created that, because I know every man has the ability to do that if they're willing to give themselves the chance to just really hone in on those foundations and build a strong man every single day. So when everything goes to crap, they can still sit there as a strong man, knowing that they've trained to such a high standard that they're not going to be moved. And so that's what that's about.
And when you got the fundamentals down straight, as you and I both know, then the big challenges of life, you're able to handle them no matter how obscure they are, no matter how out of left field they come, because you've really got the most important things right. And all of the other stuff takes care of itself when you get the fundamentals right.
Absolutely.
When you get the important stuff right.
Absolutely.
Hey, man, I'm really proud of the way that you have gone through this hard work and this journey to become the guy that you are today. It was a great honor to serve with you, Johnny, when we were in 2nd Ranger Battalion, but it's even more of an honor to see the guy that you become and the way that you're leading other guys now. Man, I'm very proud of what you're doing.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that.
I want to wrap this episode up, though. I want to give you a chance. There are guys that are driving and listening to this episode, and they're thinking, man, he was talking about me today. And my life's a mess, and I'm on my 3rd divorce, and the only thing that makes me sleep at night is the pills that I'm taking or the bottle that I'm drinking, and I hate myself, and I don't like the guy that I'm looking at in the mirror. Would you wrap this episode up by just talking to that guy for a second? And obviously, you and I can't fix all of their problems in a couple of moments at the end of this episode, but can you give them just one piece of advice if they're staring in the mirror and they're saying, I don't like the guy that I'm looking at and I don't want to stay here, but I don't know what to do next?
Yeah.
So what would you say to that guy, Johnny?
Well, again, I'd have to go back to my sergeant days and tell them, compartmentalize. Compartmentalize. One foot in front of the other. Look at what you have in front of you and make one small step that is going to put you in the right direction. Whatever that win is for you, whatever that win looks like for you, do that thing. It doesn't have to be monumental. It just needs to be something small. For me, it was the bodybuilding competition. That was small for me, but that helped me to compartmentalize my life. I didn't need to look at all the ways I was being a bad man or a negative man. I just looked at a win in front of me. So for every man out there, if this is you, if you're struggling with this, you know there's something more. You know that there's a lot of pain in your heart, and you look at yourself in the mirror and you're struggling. Just give yourself one win, one small win, and compartmentalize that win. And allow that confidence to start surging back through you when you realize you accomplished that.
Yeah, that is a great piece of advice. The guys that are listening, that are saying, man, Johnny has a lot of great things to say. I want to hear more about this guy.
Yeah.
How do they learn more about you, about the podcast, about the Wild Man Experience or Elite Man community?
Yeah. So also, Jeff, I don't know if you know this, but I did actually just release my first book, Design the Man Within.
What? Look
Yeah,
at this.
I got to send you a copy.
Tell everybody about the book. Tell everybody where they can get the book.
This is also a way that men can do things. Like if you're not comfortable with sharing or putting yourself in a community, grab a book like this that can help you design the man within, where it's like, I give the tools for guys. I share my journey. I share the things that I experienced because I know that they're struggling with them, because I did too. And I give them tools on how I got out of this, on how I gave myself the ability to succeed. So
all right,
designthemanwithin.com is where you can find the book. And that's got the link to Amazon. And it's also available on Barnes & Nobles, Target, Walmart, everywhere. That's where you can get the book. And the book is to really help guys kind of usher in this whole aspect of how do I start working on myself piece by piece, because I know there's something more. So I'll leave that there.
Johnny, hold on just a second. Yeah. I didn't realize that you had a book out there. I tell you what we're going to do, man. I want somebody who's listening to get that book for free. So we're going to, at the end of this episode, I'm going to tell you how I'll give you a copy of Johnny's book, what you need to do in order to get a free copy of it. But tell everybody a little bit more about how to connect with you on your podcast or the Wild Man Experience.
I appreciate that, Jeff. Yes. And that's amazing. I really am grateful for you doing that. And yeah, you guys can hook up with me at johnnyelsasser.com, which is JOHNNY and then ELSASSER. From there, there's everything. My Wild Man Experience, my podcast, the Elite Man community is available there. That's the one-stop shop for everything. So make sure you guys head over there if you want to connect.
All right.
And see what I have going on. So, and then from there, there's also the email list that you can subscribe to, where we share a lot of free content comes out through the email. And then obviously you'll see anything that I have up and coming as far as events and things like that we're putting together.
And like always, for the listener, if you're driving and you didn't catch that, don't worry about it. We're going to put the links in the notes to this episode and let you know how you can get connected with his website. We'll also put a link to his book, the link for the book in the notes to this episode too. Man, Johnny, thank your wife for being such an amazing influence on you.
Yeah.
But thank you for coming and pouring into the listeners on this episode of Unbeatable.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for having me on, and truly grateful for your support and also to have served with you.
Yeah, you too. See you around. Hey guys, you just heard a great piece of advice. If you're sitting there and you're looking in the mirror and you don't like the guy or the gal that's looking back at you, remember what Johnny said. If you do nothing, nothing changes. And maybe you're not sure how to fix all of the problems and make all of the difficulties go away, but his brilliant advice is just do one small thing today. And when you've had that small win, start working on another thing tomorrow. And when you get a small win there, start working on another thing the next day. And pretty soon, you start to become a very different person. Man, I am so proud of what Johnny said and how he has rebuilt himself, recreated the man that he was now that he's back from combat. I want you to check out his book. I'm so impressed by the fact that he's written a book that I told you we're going to give one away. All you got to do to get a copy of his book is become part of the Unbeatable Army. One of the listeners in the Unbeatable Army is going to get a free digital copy of Johnny's book, Designing the Man Within, free. And if you're not part of the Unbeatable Army, it's totally free. This community where we deliver content to you all week long. In order to become part of the Unbeatable Army, just go over to unbeatablearmy.com. Now, if you want to know more about Johnny, just check out the links on this episode in the notes to his website and learn more about his podcast and about the experience that he's created for men. But if you want to know more about this podcast, why don't you go ahead and follow us on social media? And if you've just stumbled across this and you really like what you heard today, we have lots of guests that are just as incredible as Johnny. And why don't you go ahead and subscribe to us on your favorite podcast platform? We've got some very faithful, very loyal fans that are just knocking it out of the park, letting other people know about this podcast. And the fan for this week is Rob Breland. Rob, thank you for being so faithful. Thank you for being so connected. Thank you for letting other people know how much of a difference the Unbeatable podcast is making in your life. Guys, thanks for joining me this week, and I'll see you right back here. Same time, same place next week. God bless.